you have this great article out at your website, Shadowproof, on the Afghan War and the dissenters we should have listened to. And basically, you have the best list here of like 5 or 6 people who were really right on this at very important and key times, and people who just weren't listened to. And so I thought maybe it would be good to start at the beginning, back in 2001. And I'm a libertarian, so sometimes I'll say there was only one person who voted against the 2001 authorization for use of military force, and my audience will assume that I'm talking about Ron Paul. And while he was good on this war from very early on, it was actually only Representative Barbara Lee who voted against it. So tell us a little bit about Representative Lee.
Yeah, Representative Barbara Lee stands out as someone who essentially was in favor of an international law enforcement response to whoever the perpetrators were of 9/11, rather than having an open-ended conflict. And she recognized from the beginning, from the very beginning, and it's reflected in her speech against the vote, or in defense of her no vote, where she says that she basically predicts that they're signing over this blank check to President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney and the rest of the administration at the time that's going to allow them to wage war in almost any country, so long as they can claim that there are people who are connected to the September 11th attacks, or so they can claim there's some group associated with terrorism that can be loosely connected back to the group that committed this act upon the United States on 9/11. And so she stands out there, stands up in the chamber and says that she's going to vote against it. And ever since, for the last 20 years, she had spent working to get the authorization repealed because it remained in force. It was the main justification and reason for behind the I don't know if it's fully legal. Obviously, Ron Paul would be the better person to get involved in something like this. But this was the way the Bush administration claimed it was legal to be invading Afghanistan, was because they had this authorization for the use of military force. And so what happens is she is one of the chief advocates against the war. There are others that join. You mentioned Ron Paul. Walter Jones is someone who's actually a Republican who comes around to being opposed to not only the Afghanistan war, but an opponent of the Iraq war, even though he was a supporter. And I do mention him and a handful of other representatives who form a kind of bipartisan coalition. A kind of, well, in my view, I don't really like the word bipartisan, so I talk about it in terms of transpartisanship in the positive sense of people who are progressives and libertarian Republicans to some degree working across against these wars, because we know that the bulk of the support for these endless wars tend to come from the center, with the people who fashion themselves as moderates or they're neoconservatives, or you have people who are centrist liberals or neoliberal types that favor these open-ended wars. And so this small coalition spoke up against the surge when that was a big deal back in 2009 when Barack Obama was first elected. Remember that President Barack Obama came into office claiming that the Afghanistan war was the good war. He was opposed to Iraq. It was easy for him to be opposed to the Iraq war. It was trendy. He gave a speech in Chicago at a rally that was attended by anti-war activists in the city, which is actually where I'm based. And so he let that stand, but he was a defender of the Afghanistan war, even going so far as to, I think even during one of the debates, he advocated for the kinds of incursions we would see into Pakistan. We saw reflected in drone strikes, and he was in favor of that kind of special operations actions, even if they didn't have like an authorization for war against Pakistan. So this moment in 2009, where they're moving to surge troops, there's not really a whole lot of debate. There's a bit of pushback from President Joe Biden at the time he's vice president, but the difference is over 10,000 troops. So don't believe this dishonest representation from President Biden that he was against the surge. He just disagreed about the number, and it only came down to being for 10,000 less troops than President Barack Obama ultimately sent to Afghanistan. So she's been against the surge. These other people in '09 and around 2010 begin to form more of a political opposition to the Afghanistan war. But it's extremely difficult in the Obama years to be opposed to the Afghanistan war because he dubbed it the good war.
Yeah. And I really like your distinction between bipartisan and transpartisan, because, I hear bipartisan, and to me, that's a scary word. Something bad's probably going to happen from Congress, but the transpartisan stuff, because we do need those kind of coalitions of Republicans and Democrats to push back against this stuff, because the senators of both parties won't do that. One of the things, I guess, that Barbara Lee has done is really fought against this the whole time, and is trying to get it repealed for 20-something years now, and with little success. And so, that's one of the other things that, I think she should really be commended for, is fighting for this the whole time. I remember, I think it was 2016, she held a hearing and had Daniel L. Davis and a couple other really good people. Michael Pearson, I think, is the head of Veterans for Peace. He was there and gave an excellent speech. And she's elevated all these other voices with her opinion. And even if a lot of these hearings I see her host, and she'll co-host it with, used to be Justin Amash, now it's probably a Thomas Massey type. But they co-host it, and there's 4 representatives who show up, maybe a couple others poke their head in for a couple minutes. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything else on Representative Lee or the fight to repeal the 2001 AUMF.
Well, I just say that one of the tremendous difficulties in getting this passed, I think, or one of the reasons why it may not have been so appealing to the anti-war movement to support the AUMF repeal more openly, is because oftentimes, if I may be wrong, if I'm wrong, please go back later and retract this for me. But from my experience following these hearings, it tends to be that they want to put the repeal in a defense budget or a military budget that's expanding and making the funding even more gargantuan than it already is. And the way they talk about the repeal of this AUMF is to admit that it's outdated and should not have force anymore, but to say that they're going to go back to the drawing board and conceive of a new AUMF that would cover the current state of the world and apply to the latest formations of terrorist groups, such as ISIS, because they've been trying to apply the AUMF to any sort of operations they want to conduct against ISIS, but they had nothing to do with 9/11. And so you can't legally apply it to those conflicts or any sorts of invasions or actions you would want to launch. And the problem here is that that when you look at the complexity, it seems like people get to the point where they agree that the AUMF should be repealed, but they're so married to these endless wars that they won't do anything to get it off the books.
Right. Yeah, you can support repealing the 2001 if they're going to repeal and replace, which is often the language that you see if they're going to do it, because the groups are waging the wars against now, Al-Shabaab, ISIS-K in Afghanistan. They didn't exist in 2001, so it's kind of hard to use something past then to justify these wars, and so it probably would give them a lot more expansion.